Anyway, so this presentation is about the history of game books. And game books is basically, or the word game book is basically a generic term for choose your own adventures. Books that involve some sort of game mechanic, whether you're deciding to come in or to what happens next, or maybe you're solving a puzzle to figure something out, or what have you. And the term has just sort of evolved. And the key thing is that these are all things that exist in book form. There's really no digital element to them. But let me tell you a little bit about myself. First of all, I made a program called Twine. I always like asking this question because the results are super, super varied. How many people here have actually heard of Twine before? Cool. So Twine is this program that lets you build choose your own adventures, actually. It's free, open source, it's very easy to use, and it outputs to web pages, so you can just post it wherever you feel like a Dropbox or what have you. I'm also co-founder of an indie game studio on Map Path. We build text games as well. Finally, I'm also on the board of directors of the Interactive Fiction Technology Foundation, and it's a nonprofit dedicated to preserving text-based gaming. And that includes things like parser games, like the games like Zork, other kind of type it in to do stuff kind of games, choice-based stuff like the Twine stuff or the Choose Your Own Adventure, and really all kinds of things. Anything that really is text-based we're interested in. So in short, I'm really into text-based games. And for me, game books had a huge influence on me. I was right in sort of the sweet spot for when they were popular. I grew up in the early 80s, and for me, my experience with them was in my public library. So the way it was set up at the time was basically there's like a shelf of Hardy Boy mysteries, which I loved because I love mysteries, and then an equally large shelf of Choose Your Own Adventure books. And the funny thing is, like, I didn't really realize it, but they were one of the first experiences I had with games, period. And I think this isn't that uncommon. And they exist in this really interesting point in gaming history. Because this was an era, this is like the early 80s, late 70s, this is an era where a lot of games didn't even have the space to include text in them. This is an excerpt from the Wasteland, like the original Wasteland manual. And what would happen is during the game, it would say like read paragraph 3, and it'll tell you what happened, because there just wasn't the space for it on disk. Now obviously there were games like Zork, like I was telling you about a second ago, where it's all text-based and you get all stories. And there were later on, this is Magnetic Scrolls, the Pawn, they add graphics to it, but this was like a genre unto itself. Like it's kind of unusual if you think about it. Like you have to specifically go to the section in the game store back when there were well, I guess there still are game stores, but you know what I mean? Like there are sections where, like, I want the games that have some text in them. And that's sort of unique. The other reason why I think they occupy a really interesting point in gaming history is pure economics. So this is Adventure, one of the first games ever sold for the Atari 2600. Anybody have a guess about how much you had to pay for it in a store back then? $5?
50.
About 30 to 50 bucks, which sounds reasonable, except when you consider that was 1976 dollars, when that's actually about $100. So like that's really out of the range of your average child like me, let alone adults even. So likewise, this is Sugarcane Island, the first Choose Your Own Adventure written back in #76. This retailed by comparison for $2.25, which equates to about $8 in 2016 dollars. And the thing about it, on top of that, not only was it much more inexpensive, but you could get them from the library. This is also one of those like old person moments where it's like, it used to be that you couldn't get games at the library. And so it's this very sort of democratic almost form of games. So let me go back to this previous slide. Do you guys notice anything wrong about what I just told you about it? Let me zoom in.
You said it was dispersed.
Yes, exactly. But it's numbered 62. And the reason behind it is the reason for this is that this actually wasn't what it was originally published as. It looked like this when it first came out. And this is it's interesting because A, it's hardback, but B, you'll notice there's nothing mentioned here about Choose Your Own Adventures. And the reason behind it has to do with how the book came to be in the first place. So it was written by Edward Packard, this guy. This is him in 2016, roughly, or actually 2010, roughly. And in the late 60s, early 70s, he's a lawyer living in New York, and he's kind of a frustrated writer. And he's tried to write children's books, but nobody really is interested in what he writes. No publishing company goes for them. But he has two daughters, and he tells them bedtime stories. And one night, you know, as kids do at the end of story time, one of them says, well, what happens next? And he says, what do you think? And out of that tiny little moment, he says anyway, he decides, he gets the idea for a choose your own adventure story, or what becomes choose your own adventure. This is 1970. He begins looking for a publisher. No one is interested at all. Until 1975, about 5 years later, a tiny, tiny press called Vermont Crossroads Press publishes that book with the cover that we just saw a second ago. It goes on to sell 8,000 copies total. However, this guy, Ray Montgomery, is one of the co-owners of Vermont Crossroads Press. And he thinks the idea has some merit to it, and he has better publishing connections. So he reaches out to Bantam and manages to cut a contract with them. And it's a funny contract. Basically, what happens is that both Ray and Edward Packard get separate contracts with Bantam to write books for the Choose Your Own Adventure series. As a result, the first one under that actual label is this one, The Cave of Time, still written by Edward Packard, but he actually wrote it much later than Sugarcane Island. Ray, aka R.A. Montgomery, wrote a bunch of other books himself. And I'll pause here for a sec to talk about the fact that they have very different approaches to writing choose your own adventure stories. And I think that sort of isn't glossed over because it's been so long. R.A. Montgomery had he had this freewheeling approach where, so for example, in The Abominable Snowman, nominally speaking, you're a mountain climbing person. That's like sort of the setup of the story. But there's a point at which it says, like, well, what do you want to do? And one option is go climb a mountain or not. And to his point of view, either option is totally fine. He will tell you a story regardless of what you want to do. And so the stories are like all over the place. Like, so if you decide to hang out at base camp, like, this isn't actually what happens in the book, but like base camp is haunted, you know, and you deal with a ghost. And like the stories are very rambling, in my opinion. Edward Packard tends to tell stories that are very cohesive, in my opinion. So like, for example, he wrote a book called Who Killed Harlow Thrombey, which is a mystery. And there's only one solution to that mystery. You go through it almost like a traditional, like an RPG adventure or a video game or something like that. You discover who did it, and that's sort of like the end of the book. And to me, like his books are so much more focused and just coherent that they're much more enjoyable to play or read through now, at least as a grown-up. But at the same time, I think, you know, like the thing is, the R.A. Montgomery books kind of took over in people's imagination. Like if you have ever played a Click Venture on ClickHole, like they are completely bonkers, and they really, I think, they take after R.A. Montgomery. Anyway, all told, after this point, once they get an actual good publishing deal, they go on to sell, the Choose Your Own Adventure series goes on to sell about 250 million copies. It actually spawns, obviously, a bunch of different imitators. So like other publishing companies end up cloning it with like the Which Way Books series. Star Challenge is like a sci-fi thing. The Time Machine series is interesting because it is published also by Bantam, but it has very different goals. It is what's the word I'm looking for? It is it's aimed at being educational, meaning, so like there's no like even bandying about the fact that, yes, this is intended to teach kids something. And it's all based in fact, which is also kind of unique. So the basic gist of it is that you go back in time to a particular era, you're trying to recover an artifact. And the thing that I found really interesting was that the artifacts in question are real. Like if you try to find like whatever you're looking for in the quest for cities of gold, like that's not in a museum anywhere. It really is lost to time. The other thing that's interesting too, from more of a game design point of view, is that this is one of the few series where you can't actually lose, because you have a time machine. So it's like if things go wrong, you just go somewhere else and start over. So it's designed to be forgiving, designed to teach you stuff. It's kind of an interesting artifact. In particular, there's one that I always come back to, because I think it's really actually a unique take among games, period. And so it's about World War II, but you don't play a soldier at all. In this particular one, you are sent back in time. So the setup behind it is that you are exploring the Warsaw Ghetto at the beginning and throughout World War II. The true part of it is that there was a Jewish historian who's confined to the ghetto, and he realizes this whole experience is likely going to be erased by bad guys. And so he actually collects as much evidence as he possibly can, and like photographs, documents of their life, just everyday life, and hides them in milk jugs, not like our milk jugs, but like metal milk jugs. Hides them throughout Warsaw so that, again, bad guys can't find them. All but one of them have actually been recovered after the war. And so the point of this book is to locate that one missing milk jug. And it's just fascinating to me because it's actually it is written with the appropriate gravity for the situation. It is about what life is like in terrible, terrible circumstances as best that they can portray it for like a middle school audience. And it's just interesting to me because like there aren't that many, at least that I know of, examples of games, period, whether they're digital, analog, whatever, that try to convey the civilian experience in a war. Like the one example I can think of that was just recent was this War of Mine. And that was sort of like a weird idea to people. They're like, oh wait, like I'm in a war, but I guess I'm not, like their bad guys aren't indicated directly over there, and it's not like, you know, Battlefront or what have you. And so I always go back to this because it's actually really well done. And you can tell like the authors actually put in real effort, and like as opposed to a lot of choose your own adventures which feel kind of like frivolous in a lot of ways. This takes things very seriously, and actually is very successful for it, I think. Obviously it goes on to do like all kinds of like licensed properties and so forth, and video game companies get into the mix. And then role-playing game companies like pen and paper role-playing game companies start creating things, and then the books start getting a little bit more complicated. So for example, Iron Crown Enterprises, which owned the rights to Tolkien's works back then, at least in RPG form, they produced a bunch of books, like the Mines of Moria there in the upper left is one example. And they actually start adding, like there's a character sheet that you get, like every time you make a choice, it takes a little bit of time. And that actually affects what kind of ending you get. Like there's another one where you're Saruman's apprentice and you realize like, oh wait, he's actually evil, I gotta go tell the good guys. And so depending on how long you take, like that determines how successful you are. TSR gets into the business, although their stuff is more or less just like pick what you wanna do. The other ones I wanted to call out were, the Lone Wolf series down in the middle there. That was interesting because they're an actual series where you get to carry over character from one book to another. And so like it's sort of like an RPG campaign in a funny way. But it also directly, very clearly demonstrates how that can cause problems for game balance. So like in the first or the second book of Lone Wolf, like you get the best sword in creation, or you can anyway, if you choose right. And which is great for those first two books, but then it's like, well wait, if you are at book 5 and somebody's new to the series, like how do you possibly deal with that? Like, cause it's like, well, if you might have the best sword, or you might be just some chump who just got started, and like, how do you balance the encounters accordingly? The other books the other RPG kind of book series to take a look at, if you're interested, is the Fighting Fantasy series. And they were created actually by Steve Jackson, not the Steve Jackson of Steve Jackson Games, but the Steve Jackson of Games Workshop, like the Warhammer 40K peep guys. And this was sort of their early start, or one of their early products. Oh yeah, I'm gonna actually, yeah, you're right. And in general, I'll jump ahead a little bit. Like the Fighting Fantasy books exist in ports, or many of them anyway, have been ported to like iOS and Android, as well as Escape from Deathtrap Dungeon is I think a game on Steam, I believe also. But that has like kind of an interesting history to it because it sort of like leaves behind the game book aspect of it. And it's like, oh, it's like a dungeon, right? Death traps. And I'll get to that point in a sec, but it's an interesting sort of, it's an interesting point in history, basically. Anyway, in general, like if you're interested in this particular aspect of it, I definitely would recommend checking out gamebooks.org. It's this very encyclopedic website. So like if you're like, oh, I remember this one series I read like 20 years ago or whatever, but I don't remember what it was called. Like this is a great resource for that because it lists out all the series. It has pictures of the covers. I've never actually done it, but you can even like users on the site will say like, I'm willing to trade this one particular copy for somebody else or to someone else. Because obviously all these things are like way out of print. But this isn't actually even where things started. The choose your own adventure concept actually dates back about 40 years before 1976. And obviously this point, like the earliest game book, is a point that's really open to debate. But for me anyway, the clearest example is this one. And this is written by Dennis Wheatley. He's sort of a pulp writer. And of like lots of different genres. He was kind of one of those guys who like, I will write whatever you publishing company are interested in. And so it starts off with a letter that you see, the kind of thing that you always see in choose your own adventure stories, which it has to explain like, this is not a normal book, by the way. You gotta read this carefully. And so like the point of it is like basically, let me pick out the best part here, it says. So basically it's sort of documenting a particular murder investigation. It says, on reaching the end of the investigating officer's fifth report, all of the available evidence is to hand, yet he finds himself unable to solve the mystery. He then receives instructions to arrest the murderer from his superior, who has never seen any of the people concerned, but reaches the correct solution of the mystery solely upon the evidence in dossier form, exactly as it is presented to you here. And yeah, so it's very similar to this, like, watch out every time you open a choose your own adventure story, don't read this, start to finish. In any event, what happened, the book came with an envelope, and it sort of takes, basically it's a very literal interpretation of the whodunit. When you decide that you think you know based on the evidence who actually murdered this guy, you open the envelope and then you find out what actually happened. Almost a tiny bit like Clue, except with more actual narrative to it. So the book, as it is really a collection of artifacts. So like, for example, it comes with fake telegrams. There are some photos that they posed or they set up that show the crime scene and things like that. It even comes with a little fabric swatch that's supposed to contain a blood stain from the dead guy. Nobody's really 100% clear on what they used to fake the blood, but there was totally that in there. And so this book isn't interactive per se in the sense of like the narrative never changes. However, you yourself are sort of playing the game by reading it, by deciding what you think happened. In a lot of ways, it's similar to this book, which came much later. It's roughly contemporary with Choose Your Own Adventures. It's Masquerade. And it is a collection of illustrations that are just nice to look at in and of themselves, but the author decided to bury this thing. It's like a golden hair somewhere in the UK, and put clues in Masquerade, the book, that would tell you exactly where it is. And the clues sort of give you a latitude and longitude. The funny thing is, it's a great story about it ends up being a great story about social engineering, because the way that this thing was actually found was not through solving the book clues, but because a guy happened to know the author's ex-girlfriend and managed to squeeze that information out of her. So it sort of is anticlimactic, but I think it's a funny story. In any event, the entire thing of Murder Off Miami is documented online. It's actually done as a, quote, let's play, even though basically it's just photos of the book. And it does include what's inside the envelope. And so it's fun to read through. I also recommend this website in general, like this blog. It's the Digital Antiquarian. Goes through and talks about the history of the book. And also what happened, sort of why no one is, I'm assuming you guys probably have never heard of this book before. I hadn't before I did some research. And the reason why is that they discovered, lo and behold, having all these fake telegrams and bloodstains and whatnot turned out to be incredibly expensive from a publishing standpoint. And so like later books were just like, well, here's some telegrams. And eventually the whole idea sort of proved to be a fad. Moving forward a little bit, about 5 years, I'm gonna not try to pronounce the names of stuff. But in English, it's known as The Garden of Forking Paths by Borges. And the interesting thing is it's a short story about a book. It's not about the thing that is merely just described as a concept. It's almost like a thought experiment. And he writes, in all fictional works, each time a man is confronted with several alternatives, he chooses one and eliminates the others. In the fiction of Sui Pen, this fictional author in the story, He chooses simultaneously all of them. He creates in this way diverse futures, diverse times which themselves also proliferate and fork. And so really it's just him brainstorming, in my mind, Borges, and sort of anticipating everything that's going to follow it. You can read the entire story. It's very short, actually, online. You probably can just Google it, but that is one particular source. Skipping forward about 20 years is a thing called Tudor text. And this is actually a published series of books. So this one is just an example cover, and they're all very educational in nature. They also go by the name programmed learning. And this idea of programmed learning actually originates with this guy. Anybody know who this is? It's B.F. Skinner. Yeah, so you guys probably, it sounds like you know who B.F. Skinner is. You may know him from Skinner boxes. And the whole thing, as a result, has this very like sinister, not so nice vibe to it. And let me give you one example, just one example. This is from a book that purports to teach you about algebra. And again, it begins with this note about like, this is not a normal book, which I find this fascinating how like, this is the common thread through all these things. There always is an explanation of like, this looks like a book, but it's not, don't be scared. And at any event, the one thing that I like to call out in this particular prologue is, it says, your progress through this course will depend entirely on your ability to choose right answers instead of wrong ones, and by your endurance, which I think is a really interesting statement to make. So this particular example is about a book that's it's trying to teach you algebra. And so it begins with a chapter about mathematical truths. And sort of, I found this just amazing that right out of the bat, or right out of the gate, we go here. So this is actually what was in the book in the 1950s, talking about a book that is entitled, or trying to teach you math. Question is, in the sentence, all women are poor drivers, which words are the subject and the verb? I will not take a poll, but the right answer is all women is the subject and are is the verb. And, you know, it tries to do this smug little, please note immediately that we haven't said anything about whether that's actually true or not. But like, what an example to choose, right, in the first place. Like, anyway, not a fan of this particular series. However, the interesting thing is that the Fighting Fantasy guys, Steve Jackson, Ian Livingston, actually cite this as an example of something they had seen before and had been like, well, maybe we can adapt this for game purposes. If you want to learn more about this terrible book series, there's an entire website dedicated to it and actually goes into more of the details of that particular book. But it's very rote. Like, it's very like, you did you chose the right answer, you chose the wrong answer. Okay, here's the wrong answer and why it's wrong or whatever, which is not bad as a teaching technique necessarily, but it's not like, from a game design point of view, it's super boring. I'll move forward about 5 years to a book called Hopscotch by Julio Cortázar. And this is kind of a doorstop of a book. It is 576 pages long, consists of 155 chapters, but good news, the author tells you that 99 of them are expendable. You don't have to read them if you don't feel like it. And it's really interesting. So again, once again, we have an explanation of how to read the book. And he says, you can either, if you want to, start from the beginning and stop when you hit chapter 56, or if you like, alternatively, you can follow this chapter order that he's laid out in the table below. And the interesting thing about this is that it's not immediately obvious, is that if you follow his order, you read 2 chapters, or several chapters twice, and in one chapter, never. There's a third option that he offers, and that is simply you can make up whatever order you think is right. And this sort of, in a funny way, is echoed in an Edward Packard book called Inside UFO 5440. And the basic gist of this particular book, it's a goofy kind of space exploration kind of story, but the general idea is you're trying to find a planet that no one has ever discovered before called Ultima. And you go around, you do your typical, like, I'm picking which way to go, which planets to land on, whatever. And naturally, sort of as a matter of course, you're going to flip through and you'll see this like kind of full page spread that's an illustration of something that looks really cool, right? And naturally, like, you might be tempted eventually to check out what happens in the page following it. And if you do, you find this passage that says, you did not make a choice or follow any direction, but now somehow you are descending from space, approaching a great glistening sphere, It is Ultima, the planet of paradise. As your ship slowly and gently descends, you look down on a meadow filled with flowers. Beyond them, white-capped mountains tower above hills of golden green and smoky blue. Before you lies a crystal city, adorned by sparkling lakes and flowering trees. And it goes on to describe sort of how you land. And one of the characters explains, no one can choose to visit Ultima, says Alinka, nor can you get here by following directions. Was a miracle you got here, but that is perfectly logical because Ultima is a miracle itself. And obviously the really interesting part is this is a book where in order to succeed or find the best ending, you have to subvert the book, the rules of the book. And obviously that happens a lot in games in general. But the interesting thing I've found about game books is that some of them take very approaches that are completely the opposite, that try to prevent you from cheating, sort of, or what would be considered cheating. So for example, like the fighting fantasy books are actually really good examples of this. You'll find a key in one part that says, like, if you ever read the phrase, you find yourself, anywhere in the rest of the book, add 13 to the page number or the section number you're on, and go to that, and that's like, it will show a hidden passageway. And so that way, because obviously, like, if you're reading a choose your own adventure story and it's like, did you find the key? You're gonna be like, of course I did, right? Yeah, totally. And so this is one way to protect it, sort of, from cheating, which is, I love the idea of like cheating a book. But the other thing that was super devious about it was in one of their books, originally called House of Hell, but when it came over to the US, they're like, well, we can't really put hell in a book for kids, so we'll call it House of Hades instead. There's still total Satan worship in this book, by the way. Like, I loved it as a kid. But there's a part where, like, there's a particular weapon that you find, and of course this super spooky mansion, of course they keep the one dagger that's actually going to hurt the final boss hidden away in this mansion. And the really interesting part is, like, there's a part where you find a secret door. And so it says, like, you find a secret door and push through and see what's what. The same exact passage, word for word, is repeated 3 other places inside the book. So that if you flip through trying to figure out, like, where is this secret door that I'm trying to find, you're probably going to be defeated by that. You'll flip to it, and instead on the passage it's like, oh, there wasn't anything here as it turns out. And it's this funny little, like, almost like copy protection, like cheating protection thing that really only exists in those books. At any rate, if you're interested in hopscotch, though, you're going to have to hit up your local bookstore. There isn't really that much, like, it's just so much text that it really only exists in printed form. The final thing that I want to point out as like a predecessor to the series is a short story called A Story Your Way, and it was part of the Oulipo movement, which is written by this guy, Raymond Queneau. You can kind of tell from his portrait here that he was not entirely serious about things. And he was part of the Oulipo movement, which is sort of like it was a artistic movement in France that their credo or their goal was the seeking of new structures and patterns which may be used by writers in any way they enjoy. And you'll see it sort of through the whole thing, enjoyment or pleasure as this funny little sort of thread going through the whole thing. And so this story is short enough that we can play it right now, I think. Let me make sure we have, yeah, we're good on time. So the way I'll do it is whoever shouts out the first thing, I will pick it. I have to finish reading it. That is the one ground rule. It's like Jeopardy. 1, would you like to read the tale of the 3 sprightly peas?
Yes. Yes.
I heard yes. Okay, so I'll go to 4 here. Oh shoot, let me zoom in a little bit. Once upon a time, there were 3 wee peas dressed in green, dozing cozily in their pod. They had chubby moon-shaped faces and breathed through their funny little nozzles, snoring softly and euphoniously. If you prefer another description, go to 9. If this one will do you, proceed to 5.
9.
Okay, nobody liked that. Once upon a time, there were 3 wee peas who traveled the open road. In the evening, footsore and weary, they would drop off to sleep in no time at all. If you wish to know what happened next, go back to 5. If not, proceed to 21. Okay. In this case, 2, the tale is finished. Ended. And that's the end of it. So it's super short, as you can see. And this is actually a flowchart of what it looks like. Interestingly, you can go in loops in this. So you can see, like, 11, you can just, oscillate as much as you want to. before you move forward. There are also a couple of ways you can go back and forth. It looks very atypical compared to this. This is a diagram of how Sugarcane Island kind of plays out. And you can kind of see, like visually, like this is a garden of forking paths, right? Like once you get down to like 2 or 3 choices in, you're kind of locked into a particular ending. There are a few instances where you can sort of jump the rail. So you can see like 84 on the far right, that lets you kind of jump over back into the middle. Likewise, 87 in the middle, or the bottom right there, will actually let you jump nearly all the way to the beginning. But by and large, it's very linear, or quasi-linear, I guess. The other thing that I think is interesting is, like, again, it's focused so much on, like, well, what kind of story do you want to hear? And it's very literally asking you, like, well, what do you want to know? Whereas choose your own adventure stories are very kind of reader hostile in a lot of the time, where like, you know, the most often kind of thing that happens to you is that you die. And so like I just love this particular one because it's just like you have a bunch of angry characters killing you with grenades. And so it's just very, very different from what ends up being kind of the norm, at least in the Choose Your Own Adventure series. The entire thing is that of A Story Your Way is online. You can play through it like we just did. And so let me pause and like kind of point out a couple things about the timeline I just laid out. First of all, it's about 40 years long, and that's about as long as it took for movies to develop sound, which if you think about is pretty frickin' short in the grand scheme of things. The other thing about it is that when I sat down when I was doing this presentation, I thought, well, okay, I went 40 years back. That's about 40 years from now. And what would I put on a timeline between then and now? And so, for example, there have been reissues of the Choose Your Own Adventure series. The interesting part is that, or the thing that people may not realize, is that the reissues only contained the R.A. Montgomery stories because he managed to land the rights to the series, which is kind of unfortunate because, you know, as I said earlier in the presentation, I'm really an Edward Packard fan, and they don't exist anymore in print. Likewise, there have been books like this one, Pretty Little Mistakes, that take the Choose Your Own Adventure format and kind of age up. Like in this particular case, it ages up the protagonist, makes her explicitly female. The question of gender has always been a tricky one in the Choose Your Own Adventure series. Very few of the books actually say like you are a guy or you are a girl. However, all the art shows you as a guy because even then there were problems. Likewise, on sort of the app side, like I was saying earlier, there are ports of these games, Starship Traveler being one of them. I like that it was one of the fighting fantasy books. The thing I like especially about the ports is that they actually do all the things you would cheat with in the books, it lets you do in the app too. So for example, at the top there it says, heal me, and so like you can just hit that button and get more hit points. And likewise, there's the free choice, so it's like if you locked yourself out of a choice, you can just hit that button and it'll let you see what the ending looks like. Those are all optional. There's like a hardcore mode, but I don't really see the point myself. It's sort of disappointing just because like I found at least the fighting fantasy books a little frustrating. They're very difficult to win at because that was sort of part of their design, is that they wanted you to have to replay them over and over again before you actually got to the right ending. And then give you like money for your value, or time for your value, or money for your dollar. In any event, the other series, or another series that I think is sort of an interesting example in this quasi-timeline is the Choice of Games series. There are 1 billion books or 1 billion games that they have published. And they sort of follow like a mixture of choose your own adventure straight, picking your path, that kind of thing. But you also have stats in these games. And so they're quasi-RPGs, but not exactly. The other example I can point to in app format or a digital format is Inkle. And they made, like the game you probably have heard of that they made was 80 Days. But also they did ports of the Sorcery series. And the interesting thing to me about them was that there were 4 books in all, and there are 4 apps. And the first 2 are relatively close to the game book experience. It shows you a map kind of your progress, but that's about it. It's still pretty much, it's text, and the text is sort of carved up differently. By the time it hits 3 and 4, they've moved away from that. And so there's like an open map that you can explore to however you like. And really at that point, the games become sort of inspired by versus sort of straight ports or translations or what have you. And like I was saying about Death Trap Dungeon, same kind of deal. It became basically almost like a Diablo, maybe with some homages and stuff like that and references to the original material. It wasn't like just like ripping it up and throwing it away, but it's still, I think what they were realizing, or they personally realized, was that it was difficult to make a compelling gamebook experience, at least in digital format. And I really feel like it's sort of an open question or open problem right now. The one example that I would put on a timeline right now is this book, Meanwhile, published in 2010. And it takes a very visual look, or a visual approach to the format. And so instead of reading text, I mean, obviously there's little cartoon or comic panels and stuff like that. But instead of turning to particular pages, you follow lines. And you can see there's like a blue tab, or a tab that has a blue line extending off of it on the lower left. So if you, in an actual printed book, what happens is that you kind of close the book up and you can see where the blue line will lead to a different page. And so there's no, there are no page numbers or anything, I don't believe. The other interesting part that I love it how it plays with particular format. So you can see like the protagonist flips a coin in the upper right corner. And so like if you really want to, you can follow the lines and decide, heads or tails. But in reality, you just kind of pick like, oh, it turned heads. And I think it's a funny comment. The whole thing involves time travel and randomness and stuff like that. And so it's an interesting comment to me about like kind of how random are things really in life and that kind of thing. So that's the one thing I would recommend. And this actually brings sort of the whole presentation to a close. And so I figure we can either do Q&A about like just stuff in general, or if there are ideas that, like if you guys were watching, or as you guys were... What was that book title again? Oh, sure, it's Meanwhile. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it actually, I should also add it has an app as well, so you can just play it in digital format as well.
One thing I remember in going through a number of game books that are put out by Steve Jackson Games,
right.
Not the British Steve Jackson, is one thing they would commonly put in was basically Easter eggs. A number of paragraphs there's no way to logically get to.
Right.
Would have just ridiculous results on it, usually resulting in your hideous death, because they're supposed to, I guess, punish cheaters somehow.
Right. Well, no, I mean, because realistically, like everybody's going to go, at least, maybe I'm revealing too much about myself. I always read through these books, like from start to finish, at some point or another. And actually, I'm going to have to jump all the way to the beginning. Because the same exact thing happens in the Wasteland manual, where like if you read the first one there, it actually was just like a thing that says, don't read these, you're going to ruin the game for yourself. The other interesting aspect is that, I believe it's in Wasteland, they have a whole parallel story that doesn't ever happen, like it never tells you to read it, where it's like aliens from Mars land and like take you aboard their spaceship. And it's actually pretty detailed, but it's completely bogus. And that's kind of nice. I mean, it's like a nifty little like, again, it's sort of like there's sort of degrees, I guess. Like, it's inevitable that when you're looking for a particular thing, like you're gonna like accidentally start reading a paragraph or whatever. And in some ways, that just prevents that. On the other hand, then you could also just read it start to finish and enjoy that in a weird, funny way.
Wasteland actually did have their own anti-cheating method. They put in stuff about you going to Mars in paragraphs, which you never do.
Right. So, exactly.
Got people looking for NASA facilities. Use that rocket ship.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Action Castle. I have heard, oh, go ahead. Oh, you have heard of it, I'm sorry. Sorry, yeah, actually I've, wait, is that a Parsley game?
Yes.
Okay. I'm trying to remember, because I'm getting confused, because I played a Parsley game that was different from that, but... What was it called?
Jungle Adventure?
I don't remember. I seriously don't recall. But there was one, I listened to a podcast episode recently of One Shot. It's a really good podcast that just does like one-shot tabletop games, and there was, I think, is Action Castle about a theme park?
Action Castle is sort of like the flagship one.
Oh, okay.
That teaches the rules, because none of the others bother to mention the rules.
You know, yeah, okay.
Why would they need that?
Yeah, actually, it might have been Action Castle that I played. In any event, it's fun. It's more actually along the lines of a parser game, since you can kind of say whatever you feel like, or
Yeah.
in theory anyway, you can say whatever you feel.
There's actually going to be a Parsley style game tonight at 1:30.
Really, 1:30 a.m. Oh man, okay, that's after my bedtime, but okay. No, Game Request. Well, like, where is it located, or where is it going to take place?
Panel 2.
Panel 2. Okay, so everybody go to Panel 2, and tell me what it's like. Okay, other questions or comments or thoughts or whatever? Go ahead.
So, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy came out with a text adventure a long, long time ago.
Mhm.
I mean, you know, in virtual format. They remade it recently
Mhm.
with pictures. Do you have an opinion on, like, do you think, like, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the text adventure is kind of notorious for, like, kind of trying to screw you?
Yes.
Like, there's just, like, ridiculous crap that you would never think of.
Right.
And you have to read it very carefully. Like, there's one part in particular after you, if you manage to pass sort of the first gauntlet of getting a towel,
Mhm.
whatever happened again, where it's like you're in a dark room and you can't see, hear, taste, or feel anything.
Right.
And then it's like, can I smell something? And it's like, you do smell something.
Right.
Like, do you think pictures, like, kind of are a detriment?
I think it really it really depends on how they're used. Like, I think there are purists who are like, text only, like, text is the best format because you use your imagination, which I kind of agree with. But, like, there's nothing wrong with text, right, or with pictures or combining the two, right? That's what comic books are, and they're great. But I don't know that, I think that it really is, with the digital stuff, it was one of those things where there are two factors sort of at play. First of all, the Infocom, like the people who made Hitchhiker's Guide originally, they were super snooty. And they were trying to make a virtue out of a shortcoming, or not exactly a shortcoming, but just, again, you know, it was a time period where you had to make trade-offs, and very difficult trade-offs. And they're like, we're gonna go text only, and we're gonna talk about how superior that is. And I kind of agree, because I like text. But they had sort of inculcated this feeling of like this purist impulse, where it's like the best things are made out of text only, because you can do so much more sophisticated things with them. And so, like, that feeling carried on for a really long time. And so, like, you had people who were resistant to graphic adventures, simply because they have graphics, which is funny because, like, the genre of text adventures is full of people, or is so obscure because people see text and you're like, I don't feel like reading a lot. And there's nothing wrong with that either, but it's just funny, like you guys are being a little bit hypocritical. And it took time in general for people to figure out how to use graphics in this medium, or in this genre of, like, adventure games. And obviously, like, the LucasArts games are great. I guess Sierra games were pretty good too. But anyway, it took time for people to figure it out. And in the meantime, a lot of people were like, well, this is stupid. In the particular case of Hitchhiker's Guide, like, they were kind of, to me, like, they kind of just tacked on the graphics because they felt like, why not? But to me, they didn't add that much to it personally. But I think, you know, opinions can vary. Cool. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the foundation that you're a part of that you mentioned earlier?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the foundation, you should give lots of money to it. So I'm just a member of the board of directors. And so our mission is basically to support the community infrastructure behind interactive fiction. And so, because the thing is, this is sort of not exactly on topic for this presentation, but you know, ever since text adventures fell out of favor, there's been a really dedicated group of hobbyists who have been really into them. And it's really interesting, by the way, to see, like, the people who started off in this hobbyist field. Actually, there are some big names, or quasi-big names, we'll say, that came out of that scene. For example, Sam Barlow, the guy who wrote Her Story, he started off doing text adventures. John Ingold is the Inkle guy, same kind of deal. In any event, so there's always been this community kind of ecosystem of text-based games. And it started off very parser-centered, and then when Twine kind of appeared on the scene, lots of people started building stuff in Twine. And the thing is, everybody, almost everybody as far as I know, involved in this scene or ecosystem has always done it because they were really into the genre, which is great. Like, I made Twine because I wanted to. Like, I wasn't looking to make money. But things cost money. So for example, like there's an IF archive that has an enormous amount of history associated with it. There's basically just everything that has happened in the text adventure world since about 1990 and before that exists on this archive. Likewise, there's an annual competition for interactive fiction that's been running for about 20 years. All these things have been supported by people who cared, and that's great. But at the same time, like, people will, you know, just life moves on. You may no longer be interested in being able to do it, or you may not have the resources to support it in terms of bandwidth, just technical support, all kinds of stuff. And so the foundation is really designed to help support people, the community at large. And so, for example, they adopted the competition this year. So they provided all the technical aspect, or the technical like hosting of the site, various stuff like that. And they also provide a way that if you want to, like, because the whole point of the competition, everyone donates prizes to it. And so, like, if you wanted to, you could donate to the foundation and be able to write it off of your taxes, which is a small thing, but it's nice. And so really, like, we just got off the ground. We started in July of this past year, and so we're still kind of getting started with things. And so, you know, you can go to the website, learn more about what projects we're working on. We're trying to provide kind of a harbor for text-based games and to help encourage them to continue to thrive. So that's the pitch. Did you have a question too?
Oh, no.
Oh, same question, okay. Yes, sir.
You had the list of online resources, and I do know that I was actually just checking on my phone to make sure the website still existed. But the Lone Wolf series, the author and most of the illustrators gave a group the rights to publish the books for free online. So the web address for that is projectaeon.org.
It's with a dash in it, right? Or is it all one word?
I think it's all one word.
Okay, my bad. Either way, yeah, I forgot, I should put that in the slides, but yeah, you can.
Yeah, that's the books, like Choose Your Own Adventure got me into everything, but Lone Wolf was my big, like, hobby for years and years. I still have all the books and everything.
Yeah, I don't know if, I have bad news for you. Joe Deaver, I guess you probably know this, though. Joe Deaver died last, yeah. The main guy behind the series just died like a month or two ago, unfortunately. Yeah, you're right, but Project Aeon is great. I certainly went through all of the books myself, thanks to that website. Cool. Yes, ma'am.
Could you put the post-net?
Yeah, sure thing. There we go. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for coming by.